Welcome to Breaking the Echo Chamber podcast. I'm Manuel da Costa, the founder of Efestra, and this is the Experimentation podcast for people who actually do the work. Not the glossy conference version, not the vendor success theater, but the messy reality of building experimentation programs that survive beyond the pilot phase. Each week we'll explore the gaps between what gets celebrated online and at conferences and what actually drives sustainable results. This podcast is all about breaking the myths that persist in this industry and keep the experimentation industry back from achieving its true potential. Now, some episodes will be my take on where the industry is broken. Others will feature leaders who've learned to see past the noise. So if you're ready to hear what experimentation looks like when nobody's trying to sell you something, you're in the right place. Now, on to our episode. Hello and welcome to another episode of Breaking the Echo Chamber. My name is Manuel da Costa, the founder of Efestra, the experimentation governance platform. And joining me today is Val Kroll. Welcome, Val.
Hey, happy to be here.
It's great to see you again. It's been ages since we've done a podcast together. For those of you who don't know me or Val, we used to do a podcast together back in the day called Conversionations. I think it's still on Spotify somewhere. It's funny because a lot of the conversations we had back then, I feel like it's deja vu. We're kind of talking about the same things again. And Conversionations was what, about 5 years ago now? So it's been, time flies. It's quite a long time. But it's a new audience now. So why don't you introduce yourself, tell our listeners who you are, what you do, and why they should be listening to you today?
Well, okay, that's a tall order. But my name is Val Kroll. I am head of delivery at Facts and Feelings, which is a consultancy that's really interested in getting organizations able to get the value out of their investment in analytics and research and experimentation. I have in-house experience in experimentation at the American Medical Association, UBS, which is where I first crossed paths with Manuel back in the day, and then had the pleasure of taking some experimentation leadership roles on the consulting side at Further, formerly known as Search Discovery. So, I've seen some stuff, and I hope that we're going to dive into a really engaging conversation today.
Absolutely. So let's start with the story, because before talking about the topic that we're going to talk about, I want to tell you the story of a CRO, an experimentation lead at one travel brand that I'd spoken with recently. And let's just put it this way, he was frustrated. And the reason for that is he'd been in all hands meetings and presentations with leaders, with senior management, talking about some really good experiment results that he wanted to present, but he kept hitting a brick wall. And he said to me that they just don't get it. They don't get the statistical significance. They don't understand the meaning of these results. And I said to myself, I keep hearing the same thing over and over again. You have these experimentation specialists or leads that are really good at the technical side of things, but somehow that doesn't translate to what the leadership want to hear, or there's a misalignment or mismatch in how experimentation is understood. So let's start with that.
Well, I feel that very deeply in my stomach because I have found myself in very similar situations when I was first cutting my teeth in the experimentation realm. I was invited to participate in this. It was an initiative with our enterprise digital strategy where we were putting all of our documents and downloadables behind single sign-on. And so we knew that there would be a decrease in the number of people who were downloading those documents, but we were hoping that that would be worth it for the value exchange of understanding a little bit more about who they were and getting them to create an account. So I was a part of this crew that involved our COO, our CMO, and we were running some experiments to try to help with the education side of it. Like, this isn't, becoming a member of the American Medical Association. This is just about creating an account. And so there were a couple tests that we ran that I was asked to present on the top floor of our building, which was like, a prestigious audience. And I remember losing my audience in the first test that I was trying to present upon. And I was kind of frustrated because I was like, wait, but the third test I'm going to talk about in my presentation here, you're going to love the results because it absolutely helped decrease the friction point within the single sign-on experience. And when people started like questioning the results, I was like, what do you mean? Like, what's going on here? And people having like all these little side conversations because it wasn't convenient, the first things that I was sharing and presenting. And so I thought this was all about, oh, they don't understand, statistical significance. I'm going to take this opportunity to grab the whiteboard marker, hop up to the whiteboard and draw some normal curves and try to show them, oh, this is what they need. And I lost the entire room. And before I knew it, the meeting was over. And I remember the COO on his way out, he said, Val, you're telling us a lot about how to make the watch, but we just need to know what time it is. And I was like, I was stunned. I like stood in that doorway for what felt like 5 minutes, but I'm sure it was only 30 seconds. But I was thinking to myself, like, okay, I'm delivering a message that my audience didn't sign up for. They didn't come to hear, they didn't come to learn about statistical significance. They're not actually trying to learn how to be someone who runs experiments. They're trying to understand, like what we've learned. And so it was a really big moment for me for like this. I have to be able to tell the story in a way that's compelling to leadership, or I'm going to lose the room every time. So, anyways, I empathize with the person from the trip or the travel company that you were recently talking to, because that's definitely a badge that I've learned along the way of how do you package that in a way that is what your audience came to hear, and starting with those audience centric stories, thinking about what matters most to them is definitely like a big moment for anyone in their CRO career. That's like a big leap for you to be able to understand how to package that.
I think that it seems like it's almost deja vu for you then having listening to that story because you've gone through the same thing. And I have a feeling that a lot of people in the experimentation space listening to this podcast right now would have gone through the exact same experience. I wonder why that is, though. Is it because there's so much emphasis on the technical education of CRO and experimentation, right? If you look at a lot of the courses, a lot of the content out there, it's about how do we run tests? How do we set it up? The technical aspects of it, the statistical significance and things around that. And that is needed, right? You need people with that kind of outlook and mindset. But I've long felt that there's a gap, a chasm between the technical experts and then the ability to translate that message. And things get lost in translation. As you said, you lost the room when you're trying to draw bell curves and to explain to them the importance of statistical significance. So what do you think, or what have you done differently over the years to counter that and to frame or package up a better narrative about your experiment?
Mm-hmm. So I do agree with you that there is a lot of emphasis on that because it is really important to the role of the person running that experiment. But I think one thing that people need to potentially hear is like, just because it's important to you doesn't mean that it's important to your audience. And if you're not telling the story that your audience came to hear, they're gonna tune out. They're not gonna be able to relate to it. And so I think I went through and kind of deconstructed the way that I had been presenting these, and I was like, is this important to me? Is this important to my process? Is this a little bit of show and tell of like how hard it was for us to get this test run in the first place? And I want to be able to share this like story of triumph of this, all these barriers that we had of like handing over the different variants through the single sign-on process? Or is it about, here's something that we've learned and here are some actions that we can take now that we know? And so I just tried to categorize like important to me, important to my story, important to the story I would tell if I was telling someone who was also in experimentation who might be able to appreciate some of those points, or is it what my COO signed up to hear for in this specific example? And so the bucket of the things that were actually important for my audience was a lot smaller than I thought it would be. And so like the formula that I kind of work with for presenting test results is like very slim and to the point, because as soon as you share the learning, the real value is in the conversation around like, what are we going to do and how do we apply it? And now I can play the role of connecting the dots between what this means and how we can apply this to different audiences or exploring net new ideas. And so it really shifts it from like, I have the stage and here's something I'm going to tell you, I'm going to present to you, versus the conversation that's really exciting around, and now what?
Absolutely. I think it's almost a bias for the technical expert to kind of show, as you said, how a watch is made, all the inner workings. Like, look at the clever ways we've crafted the hypothesis and then created the variance, and then look at the results and look at the stats behind it, and so on and so forth. And it's really good for us as in the experimentation space to learn about that stuff, to understand how everything was made.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't resonate with the leadership audience. And the reason for that is because their world is completely different.
Yeah.
I remember a similar scenario where we were coaching one of our customers, and a similar scenario, right? Lost the room. And I said, in the next meeting, instead of presenting 10 PowerPoint slides of experiment after experiment, screenshot after screenshot, I want you to do this. Only present 5 insights in simple language of what you've learned in all the experiments you run. And then connect the dots to the people in the room. So call out, Val, this insight is relevant to the initiative that that you have going, and try to get a conversation going about that. And if there's interest, then bring up the details of the experiment. Then show them the results, show them what that means, and also make it so that they can take action on the back of that, because that is what experimentation is there for. It's there to drive decisions and action. The experiments
Mm-hmm.
themselves are not the heroes of the story. It's a
Right.
vehicle,
Right.
right? And lo and behold, there was much deeper engagement in the next meeting because there was that shift. But I could tell you that I was almost not certain that she would go and do it, because it's almost like an instinct not to simplify things, especially for something that in experimentation where it feels like, look at our creativity, look at our expertise and how we design these experiments. It's almost like a show and tell of that rather than the actual value of experimentation. How do people overcome that kind of bias?
Yeah. And I, I will say that it's like, you know, that instinct is very real. Like I learned that lesson the hard way. I learned that lesson when I was an analyst, even before I got into experimentation. It's and I don't think there's any like, you know, malintent behind it. Everyone's walking into this with their best intentions, right? Thinking like, oh, this is the story that people, no one's putting together a presentation thinking, oh, I can't wait to cram this content down people's throat that I know they're going to hate. Like everyone's stepping into this with like their best foot forward, right? I think that the bias, as you kind of describing it, is a lot of times in experimentation we're able to prove. I'm using air quotes here for the simplicity of this part of the conversation, things that are inconvenient to the business at times, like things that like are kind of deviating from what the strategy is, or what the senior leaders were hoping would be the winning variations. And so we rely on this like, well, let me show you the data and then you'll believe me. But then sometimes if you show the data, then they'll question, well, what was the setup, or what was your targeting, or did you run that at the same time as that other campaign, because that would be a confounding variable. And so I think that the whole concept of being able to present with confidence and to be able to say like, hey, like I know that we were really hoping that this was going to win, because that is in service of what's, you know, coming around the corner, you know, for the next thematic campaigns that are launching, but it didn't. So let's talk about what we can do now that we know, because thank goodness we know with this experiment versus when we went live with the full shebang with the rest of the 80% investment, right? And so I think it's stepping into those conversations, assuming that you can have that conversation in a way that gets people comfortable that this is an inconvenient truth, and to like build that trust with your stakeholders all along the way, and
Yeah.
not just expecting that trust at the moment of the presentation, but making sure that you're not just taking the information of the variations and like running back into your cave and running that test and then emerging, 6 weeks later with like the result, right? So it's a lot more to it. Um, but I'll also say that there's no formula for a presentation or data storytelling, or no amount of charisma that you can bring to that presentation if you're not experimenting with things that are important to the business. No one's going to care. Like if you're saying like, oh, it was going to take too much work to get this approved from legal or the senior leader, so I'm going to go test this thing over on the side that isn't going to require any approvals, and you come and bring that story while everyone's trying to plan like the budget for this next highly contentious or potentially risky campaign. Obviously we're talking a lot about marketing centric stories, but this applies to product, digital, anywhere. um, no one's going to care.
Yeah.
So it's about breaking through to the conversation about your business stakeholders and the decisions that they have upcoming and what's most important to them. And even though it might be more difficult up front potentially to get some of those approvals or work within that, those are going to be the stories that your business partners are going to be hanging on your every word and really excited to take action because like you're playing in their sandbox.
Yeah. I think one behavior or trait that I find is really counterintuitive for experimentation specialists and teams is taking it too personally, right? When someone calls out an experiment or they don't engage in a certain way. I've seen instances where on LinkedIn, for example, someone said, "Oh, we don't trust this A/B testing thing," or "We don't see experimentation as important." And lo and behold, you get comments from all the experimentation people in the industry saying things like, "Well, you don't know stats. You don't know how to run an experiment properly." It just becomes counterintuitive to what we're trying to achieve. And I find that way of looking at it, again, the words like hippos and it's that us versus them mentality. And I think that really needs to go from this industry completely. Experimentation is a vehicle for the business. It's not the be all and end all. It is
Mm-hmm.
a way of getting an answer. And the experimentation teams are there to help inform the business about the answers that they're finding, right? I know like old school CRO will be all about like, let's run as many tests and let's run as many winning tests and so on and so forth. But really experimentation, at least the way I see it, is all about finding the answers on which way the business should move, right? It's like a compass if you think of it that way. But this bias of feeling really protective about it, like, oh, you don't get it, so you're not smart enough, or let me show you more data and then you will see
Yeah.
the truth, right? I think that really needs to stop, because one really key trait I feel experimentation teams will benefit from is humility, is being like, we are a servant leader within the business, and we're there to help you move the business forward with the answers we provide through data storytelling, or through any other medium that works for the business. But inevitably, you're going to get challenged, right? There are going to be times when your business is going to your leadership's going to turn around and say, where are the results? Where's the ROI? Where's the promises of experimentation that were given, right? So what I tend to see, like, a lot of people tend to default to things like, look, we've run so many more experiments this quarter.
Mm-hmm.
We've had so many more wins. And I personally feel that it doesn't tell the full story, and it doesn't really put experimentation in a good position. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Maybe we can talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, in the same way that we expect our business partners to be humble about when a variant doesn't win, we have to turn that on ourselves too. I agree with that. I like that a lot. And I think it's hard because, and this is something that you talked about with some of the other guests in the podcast too. It's really hard to quantify the value of your role in providing evidence to business stakeholders to make a decision or to move forward with the strategy, right? Especially if it's independent. And you talked a little bit about like old school CRO, and it's easy to understand like how it evolved the way it did. Like and we're in a different place, and I'm happy we are. Like I'm glad we matured with the times, but being able just to kind of like check the box on like look at all these activities, like look how busy we were, look how much we did, like that's I understand that instinct, but I don't think that that is continuing to lean on that. I think is a little bit of a crutch, because I do think it's incumbent upon people who have experimentation, who have all those skills, because this ain't an easy job, like working cross functionally, like with all these different teams to be able to get this stuff done. Like if you have that, like those skills, like put those to use, and embed yourself in the business with those business partners so that you can express it. But if you're able to successfully do that, your wins are the business's wins, right? Being able to help direct strategy and make certain choices about investments, or, what features should we continue to promote and build out versus which ones should we abandon? Like helping to quickly pivot away from ideas that aren't delivering the expected impact, in that smaller scale before we've said, full court press, let's like throw everything we've got at it. So the more you're able to say experimentation was helping guide those choices, then it's first of all easier to tell the story of impact, because you were saying like, here's how we played a role in the strategy and the decisions going forward. But secondly, your business partners are going to be the ones who shout your praises and say, we were able to like, quickly, pour kerosene on this idea that was working really well, that we weren't sure was going to pan out, and here's what we were able to do with it. And so I think that leaning towards that side is going to be, hopefully, my fingers crossed, the way that impact is kind of shared. And those are the stories that leadership is going to hear and say, I
Yeah.
see what you're doing there. Like I'm picking up what you're putting down. It's not about velocity, right? It's about being able to move the business forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the whole conversation about velocity was something that I touched upon with Johnny Longden in one of the episodes, where this whole industry has come about with this emphasis on activity metrics because it's easier to quantify, right? We've done X amount of experiments, so we're busy. We've done, we've got these many wins, shows we're doing well. Or even the activities such as creating those PowerPoint decks, right? Because coming up with an insight might seem like it didn't take a lot of time because it's a simple statement, but there's so much in that simple statement. So I wonder if it's also about how the industry is shaped over time, where the emphasis and the emphasis on velocity metrics, activity metrics has become so ingrained. And it's almost that it's a catch-22, because the reason why experimentation specialists are talking about velocity is because that's what the expectation is. And because the expectation is that way, they keep doing it. So it's like a vicious cycle that they're caught in.
For sure. But like, let's not pretend that other parts of the business aren't counting activities as their way of proving value too, right? I think being organizations that have like really solid goals and can truly cascade them down to the different functional parts of the business in a way that everyone feels connected to that strategy is really, really hard work. And so OKRs, as an example, OKRs done incorrectly is all about checking boxes, right? Those key results are like, did I do this thing? Yes or no. And OKRs done well is a step above that for sure. But we all know 9 times out of 10, it's about those activities. And so the marketers that we're supporting, the people in product that we're supporting, they count their activities a lot of times as goals too. And so I think like confusing outputs with outcomes, it happens everywhere. It's pervasive. And so it's easy to understand why someone experimentation was like, oh, my version of that is this, right? Or if you have a really big test win and like you've unlocked a lot of value, really big ROI, it's not crazy to think that a senior leader would say, can you do more of that? Like,
Yeah.
can you do a lot more of that. So I understand the instinct, but if you reframe even some of those metrics that you love reaching for as the mechanism for measuring the actual meaningful outcome that experimentation can provide in an organization, I think that that will get you on the right track, right? So if one of your outcomes is informing the, second half, business strategy, one of the ways that you could measure whether or not you've done that is how many tests have we run that are in service of that strategy. So it's yes, velocity, but it's a metric, one of hopefully many metrics that you could use that provide the evidence that show, hey, we're focused on the right things. Like we understand how to apply these skills, in service of the strategy. So again, like it's a yes and a little bit for me when it comes to some of those metrics. And I think putting them in their proper place, which is the metrics part of the scorecard and not the outcomes, I think will shift, the conversation to something that's a little bit more tangible and meaningful to the business.
Absolutely. And I think that also aligns well with our learning loop framework, which is the first key part of that is strategic alignment. And all the experiments that you run that are in service of those strategic initiatives are the ones that you can tell a better story about because they're in service of the business rather than spray and pray approach for testing, where you just
Mm-hmm.
do these tests and it doesn't really move the needle elsewhere in the business. Maybe some micro improvements on one part, but generally doesn't make a bigger dent. Um, One point I do want to talk about is I'm still coming back to the point about experimentation specialists have a lot of education in how to run tests and the technical aspects, which is needed. But is there a massive gap in education on how to have bigger conversations, how to really understand the business context? And we're talking about leadership engagement. We're talking about understanding and translating simple, technical concepts into executive ready language, if that makes sense. What do you think there's a skills gap over here, and should that be filled by the same people who are technical experts? And I'll give you the reason why, because there are a lot of developers, for example, that I've worked with that are really good developers, amazing developers. But you start putting them into management positions or positions of where they've got to do a lot more, they start getting a bit annoyed. I have a feeling it might be a similar case over here where people are having to begrudgingly do the work, this additional work, than just what they signed up for when they got into CRO experimentation, which is run tests and make money. Oh, at least that they were sold.
Yeah. You're definitely not leading the witness at all in this one, Manuel. um, I think that if you got into CRO and experimentation because you loved the challenge of building and you loved the analysis of the test and, figuring out like, oh, how in this case, how are we going to do our SRM check because of this X, Y, and Z constraint? Like if that's what you're wired for and that's what you really enjoy, like full stop, nothing else, my recommendation would be that you join an organization that's large enough where there's more specification in the roles, more specialization, I should say, within the roles, or even an agency side, the consultancy side. There's definitely roles where that could be where you play, and that role is extremely valuable because hopefully you're going to have a business partner or more business partner facing person on your team who will not feel encumbered by the limitations of the technology when they're talking with their business stakeholders about what the most impactful next test or experiment could be because they know they have you to help overcome all those challenges. I think that the conversations that you need to have with the business about like how to make sure that you're focused on the things that are most important to them can be challenging, right? Like because you're not always pulling people together in a room that are at your same level. You definitely need some more senior stakeholders there to understand and to center or potentially approve kind of that remit. But I will say that maybe 80% of my time when I was at Further Search Discovery, and I was there for 5 or so years, the majority of our time helping enterprise organizations is exactly in the stuff that you're talking about. We definitely had like those technical resources internally as well to help supplement some of the what the team needed to be able to use their tools and technology effectively. But the biggest gap was, how do we experiment at the speed of the business in a way that helps them demystify their biggest questions, to de-risk, that next strategy, whatever, because that's hard, because now it's not talking about, oh, what is the CRO process for a center of excellence? Like, intake turned into hypothesis, whatever. It's like, yes, there are those steps in that process, but embed it in their process, right? So how do those conversations start? What should the intake be like? What does continuous intake look like for that product team, right? So that's hard. That's really challenging stuff. So there's definitely some like small ways that you can go about it, but I would say that the skills that you're alluding to are the ones that I got most excited about, and even helping find your what do you call it, the sponsor, executive sponsor, who should be that executive sponsor, and how do you get them talking about what you do and the power of experimentation, meetings that no experimenter, no CRO is ever going to get invited to, and that's okay, but like, how do you empower them and really elevate the role of what experimentation can mean to your organization? That got kind of rambly. Sorry. I hope I answered your question.
Talk to me about the executive sponsor. So how does someone, there are a lot of single person experimentation teams of 2 or 3. We're not talking about the big experimentation setups of these tech giants. We're talking about the realistic number that you see in most organizations. Who is the executive sponsor to them? How do they go about finding one? How do they go about starting that conversation really with them?
So I'll say that one of the most successful times that I saw this come together was we were consulting with a large pharmaceutical company. And so some things that we knew must be true before we got into that conversation is, this executive sponsor cannot be in the reporting line of experimentation whatsoever. So this isn't, going up to a chief data or chief analytics officer. Like, this had to be someone in the business who believed. And so there was like already some like experimentation work that was happening, that was getting elevated. And so there was a couple people that we had our eye on, but we actually kind of wrote a job description and had one of our stakeholders kind of publish it out on like their intranet to say, now accepting applications for the experimentation executive sponsor. And these, this is what it kind of includes. And so it was asking that person to join the like kind of every 6 weeks steering committee meeting to make sure that there was like, challenges were being overcome, but also that they felt very connected to the most recent successes, like the exciting, runway for what's next. And there was like even a set of slides that it was a woman, so we gave her so that she always had like a set of 5 slides that were recent and up to date, so that if she were ever in a meeting or a conversation and she was saying like, hey, you know what, I'm going to put you in touch with this group, kind of almost like evangelizing and kind of doing some internal sales work, if you will, for people to come to the group, but then also helping tell the story of like what this means. So anyways, it was kind of positioned as this like elevated thing. And we did have like quite a few, not maybe 8 or so applications come in, which was kind of fun that it wasn't just one, that people were excited for it. And so we just made sure that she felt connected to that story of impact and was empowered to have some of those conversations again and some of those senior leader meetings again, that we don't even know what that agenda would look like, right? Because she was operating at that level, but making sure she was on the business side was something that was really important to them. I think was one of the reasons it ended up being really successful.
Got it. And in terms of experimentation teams making an impact, I know you've talked about having the executive sponsor who can have your back in those senior meetings and kind of attention to that. But there's a lot of talk in the industry that's followed on LinkedIn where people talk about, a solo CRO can also make a change. Now, I'll tell you my opinion in a bit, but what's your take on this bottom up change management, right? So can someone at the experimentation level drive change in the organization? And if so, what is the reality of it as well?
So that's hard. I, there's entire consultancies dedicated to the practice of change management. So, to think that one person who's not most likely, I'm guessing, is going to have like hands on keyboards, like probably like a very functional role, probably an IC role. Um, do I think that they can change or even like influence or build that like culture of experimentation, which is, I know, something else that you've talked about on this show? I think that that would be challenging, but I don't think that that precludes them from having impact within like their sphere of influence within the specific marketing pod that they're aligned to or the product team. Because if you're only one person, you're doing everything end to end, you likely have like a small set of stakeholders that you're dedicated to making happy. And so I think that there's like probably some like small circle impact there. And I definitely was like the first and only one person in house at two roles with teams that ended up growing very quickly. And I think that we were able to create some FOMO. So other people in the organization are like, hey, I'm missing out. Like, I want some of that goodness. Or they would ask to be invited to some of our meetings and ceremonies. And so that's like what led the team to grow. So I think like things like that can help, change an organization. But I do think that like large scale, the CEO, stopping by your desk to ask about, some upcoming experiments, if you're just, sole person, again, like in a large organization, I think would be a challenge. But don't let that dissuade anyone from getting really excited about the impact that you can have within your team with who you're aligned to. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think I think it's more about being realistic about it, because yes, you can drive some change. I'd say more horizontally within your sphere of influence, as you call it. So you might bring in people on the marketing side, a few product people into the testing sphere. But change management itself is a hard task, especially if you're just
Yeah.
one person. And even if you're one person, are you truly full-time on experimentation? You might just be part experimentation,
Good
part
point.
analytics, and
Good
then having
point.
to deal with a lot of else. My concern is more along the lines of it's aspirational, right? You can drive that change and you can drive that um the culture and stuff like that. But it's when it starts getting more disconnected from reality is where my concern is. Where people, I've spoken with a few people who've said, yeah, we've been trying this for a couple of years. I just feel burnt out because I'm not getting any results from it. I'm happier just running my experiments, and that's the end of that. And I think this is what we're trying to make them into culture warriors instead
Mm-hmm.
of just being good at what they are. Because as you said, there are entire consultancies dedicated to change management, right? It's a unique skill in itself.
Yeah.
And I think if it goes back to that point you made earlier. If you love the technical aspects of experimentation, there are definitely places where that work is going to be valued a lot more. I think when you're trying to balance those roles and the way you can do it, like my opinion is change happens top down. Bottom up can definitely facilitate it, and with the blessing of the top down can influence it in a way as well. But I feel it starts there rather than the other way up, bottom up, if that makes sense. But definitely, you're right. It shouldn't dissuade you from doing it. Just be realistic about how far that can go, and make, what kind of change you can expect as well. Because one
Mm-hmm.
of the key reasons I started this podcast is to try and bring some realism back into experimentation, where I think people were going so far to the other end, it just became really unrealistic. So
Mm.
yeah, maybe a sandwich approach, as I think someone coined that term somewhere. Like you can try doing both ways, best of both worlds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have to have that senior leadership blessing in there, or at least initiative in there for that change. I don't know if you want to counter that. Feel free to do so.
Yeah. No, I mean, even if you think about like that, the classic, I think it's like the Kubler-Ross like change management curve that talks about like mismanaged change versus well-managed change. I forget what all the lines are. We'll link it in the show notes. um, But all of those curves have a dip in productivity before they come out on the other side. And so I think that's one of the main reasons why you need cedar leadership buy-in, or it needs to come from the top down, as you're saying, is because everyone has to be comfortable with the little bit of dip before you come out on the other side, right? So, you know, oh, it's too hard, like our process is going to get slowed down, like that bad rap. And it's like, yes, and you're going to be making decisions that you're not going to have to roll back in 6 months. So, like, how much time, could you be saving, right? So, I think that there's like lots of ways to think about and measure it. But yeah, I do think that it's going to be like local maxima or
Yeah.
smaller swirls of influence, but the more evangelists that you can have that are sharing your story of impact, the better chance of you being able to build that function, or to build your team, or if you're decentralized, for you to have more partners that are kind of placed in other parts of the business, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to that point about how you communicate the value of experimentation. So
Mm-hmm.
we've come full circle on again. Do you have any final thoughts on any strategies or any ideas for better communicating the value of experimentation to people who can then maybe share the same story further upstream?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts there, because this is actually one of my favorite spaces to kind of play within facts and feelings, for sure. Um, if having that conversation to recenter what you're doing with your business partner seems intimidating, or I'm not senior enough to ask those directors into a meeting, or it's too far from what we've been doing, like people won't expect me to want to ask some of those questions, if it feels really uncomfortable, I have some things that you might be able to do that are like a small step towards it that can make it a little bit more comfortable. So, my first piece of advice, and this is off of like actual experiences, this isn't just like something I dreamed up while I was brushing my teeth. Like, I've seen these things work. Um, would be to ask to get invited as like a fly on the wall to some conversations that the business is having that you're currently not invited to. So it might be a planning meeting with, if it's with marketing, or maybe you piggyback on your analytics team and you ask, hey, like, when's one of your next big readout meetings? Like, I would love to just kind of sit in and watch, because you're going to hear the conversation and someone's going to say, like, oh, that's really interesting, or that's not what I expected. I wonder if we, and then like fill in the blank, and like your little spidey sense is going to go off, like, that's a hypothesis, that's a test. And so you can document those. It was something that Tim and I did with Tim is my partner at Facts and Feelings, did with a healthcare client that felt like experimentation didn't have a role within their marketing team. There wasn't capacity. It didn't move at the speed that they needed it to. We sat in on a month's worth of meetings such as these, and we walked away with 80 hypotheses just from listening to these marketers talk about, like, how should we approach the joint partnerships, whose logo should go first, or like whose branding should lead in the context of whatever the campaign was. And so we had like 80 of these, and we turned it back around and said, like, we've been listening, and here are some things we know that you're grappling with, that you're concerned about making the wrong choice, that you're concerned about the investments. And so let's talk about which of these are really compelling to you as like a first pass on priority. And let's figure out ways to experiment. And their first questions back were like, well, this is paid media, it's a little bit different, we can't run the A/B test the same way, or we know that this isn't on the site that has the tags for whatever tool. And it's like, throw that out the window for a second, because there's so many other ways as an experimenter, again, because we are so strategic in the way that we think, that we can bring evidence to this conversation. Like, if there is a hypothesis, I guarantee you that we'll be able to come up with some validation criteria for how we'll measure it, even if it's low fidelity. It's more evidence than they had when they were just having to make the decision in the absence of it, right? I know you're a proponent of that with the whole research section that you have within your platform, which I have loved since day one, which that was like, what, 2016 that you had that in there, something like 2015 maybe. So
Quite a while back now.
yeah, yeah, you should talk about that more, because I feel like that's a pretty big deal. But so yeah, getting invited to those meetings, hearing some of those conversations just passively. There was actually another pharma client that we worked with where what started as passive listening in a meeting, when we would get to those presentation conversations, it would kind of be like a little competition for people in the chat to be like, that's a hypothesis. We called it like spotting hypotheses in the wild. And so like there would be like 60 people on this call. And so someone would say, well, next month I wonder if we should, and be like, that's a hypothesis in the wild, like hashtag
A
hypothesis
drinking
in the
game.
wild.
It's like,
Yeah.
I'm shocked every time someone says that.
Truly. But it made it kind of fun, and it really brought it back to the context of the business. And so no one's going to say, if you're able to find ways to inject yourself into those current conversations with what's most important to them, with the strategy that they have at hand, with what's the headed, their way over the next quarter, you're never going to present those results and someone's going to like yawn and just like walk away or say like, well, we don't care about that, or that's not important, that's not meaningful. People are going to be so engaged, people are going to be so thankful that you're helping them, again, bring evidence to their work. And so like that's just like one of the best ways. So those are some strategies that you might try if having the big meeting to reorient yourself against the broader priorities of the business, to just kind of start that conversation small, can be very successful too.
I love that because, a lot of what's talked about online and at conferences is make people enthusiastic and run workshops where you can educate them about experimentation. But I feel that's such a selfish way of doing it, because you're trying to teach and educate, but what you've just shared is actually quite powerful, because you're there as the secondary person just listening in and then connecting the dots with the more relevant people in the business and saying, okay, you've come up with something where you ask the question, what if? I'm here to help you with that. Now you've got their attention a lot more than someone coming to a lunch and learn, or just attending an all hands and stuff. And I think I'll cover this in a separate episode, but I don't think we can measure experimentation maturity or even adoption through enthusiasm metrics, right? Because that's
right.
what it's like, oh, we had so many people attend our workshop, we had so many people, but they don't see the results thereafter. And the reason for that is because it's such a selfish, it's like, look at my world and I want to show you why everything I do is great. And what you've said is join their meetings, sit in on their sessions and see what they talk about, and then make a note of everything that comes up under, as you said, spot those hypotheses in the wild. Not going to know what the hypothesis is, or they're not going to even know what a hypothesis is for that matter. But I remember we talked ages ago about like calling it a bet, or calling it something non-technical or non-Euro jargon, and you can get into their world in a much better way. And that's a much better strategy. I like that a lot.
Yeah. And I don't always think the one, I agree with all that, except for I don't think it's always like, let me show you how great I am. I think a lot of it is like, it's much more comfortable to play in your sandbox. And so if you want to invite people into yours as your rules, like it's known quantities for you, it's like so much more comfortable. So it's like, I understand again, the urge that people have, but if I feel like you've seen into my world, from another story. I remember when I was at the American Medical Association, we were really ramping up. We had just bought Optimizely and everyone was like super excited. And so I wanted to run this like workshop on like how to write, a hypothesis statement, because I wanted to be receiving something that was a little bit more thorough, a little bit more thought out. And so I went to my boss and I was like, hey, can I get some budget for pizza? And he's like, sure, but for what? And I was like, oh, I'm thinking of running a session like how to write, how to craft a hypothesis statement. And he was like, I'll give you the money for the pizza, but there is no amount of pizza in the city of Chicago that is going to make 80 people show up to a workshop on how to write a hypothesis statement. Like, that is a fool's errand. Like, you are not going to win them over with that. And I remember thinking like, why everyone's so excited about testing? And he was like, yes, but they're not excited to learn how to do your job. And so anyways, there was a lot of these lessons I learned the hard way, but no one really showed up to the pizza party. And so I was like, okay, Nick, you were right. We have to find another way.
Don't know if pizza party is about writing better hypotheses. And I think that's it, right? A lot of things that are important to experimentation specialists are not even thought about. It's not even on anyone's radar in the rest of the business. But if you can make it important to them, I think that's where it becomes really valuable, because
compelling.
Compelling. And this is why I'm such a strong advocate about ensuring that experiments, research, your ideation, everything is aligned to the strategic initiatives of the business. You start with that as the starting point, because then you can't go wrong.
Yes.
If someone questions you about, oh, is your velocity low, or is your experiments have losses, you have lots of failures. Well, you can paint a better picture if your starting point is you've looked at one or two business initiatives as the North Star. From there, you've had all this research conducted to answer those questions, the ideas that came about from that, and then your experiments that you've run, and whether those experiments were validated or successful or invalidated, unsuccessful, you still got a story to tell that helps the owner of that strategic initiative make decisions from, right? So it's such a powerful way of reframing experimentation and that value beyond activity metrics and beyond velocity metrics, and more about how is it making an impact? Because ultimately, that's what I think experimentation needs to do. It has to make an impact, whether it's a revenue impact or risk mitigation impact as well, where so much value is still untouched by a lot of businesses. So any final thoughts, Val, before we wrap up the show? I know we've talked about a
Oh, I
lot.
have so many thoughts. I was like, oh, thank goodness we have another 2 hours, right? I guess two parting thoughts. Like, one is we talked about like the, starting small, fly on the wall, but I promise you will only be a couple cycles before someone in that meeting calls upon you and says like, hey, Manuel, is this actually something we can test? And you can say like, oh, you know what? I don't think that's something we can validate with a controlled experiment, but I bet we could do some user studies, or I bet we could, tap into the market research team or whatever. Or yes, absolutely, we can run a test. So you will end up being a vocal part of that meeting in very short order. So I feel like I just want to close the loop on that. And then the last thing is, other parts of the business use scorecards to manage themselves and to demonstrate their progress. I definitely think that can be a powerful tool as well. Again, as long as you keep those metrics about velocity and things like that in the metrics column as a way to show evidence towards those broader outcomes. And so organizing yourselves and getting your stakeholders bought into what does success look like, or what are we trying to achieve, can be a really powerful grounding conversation if you have stakeholders who are ready for that. And so just keep that in the back of your head too, as another way to kind of demonstrate progress as you're continuing along in the journey.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Val. This is really a really good session. As I said, it's been ages since we've been on a podcast together.
I know, too long.
It's great having you back on. Hopefully we'll see you on again for another show in the near future as well.
That sounds good. Thanks so much for having me.
So that's it for this episode of Breaking the Echo Chamber. If today's conversation highlighted gaps in the way your organization approaches experimentation, you're not alone. At Efestra, we've built the systematic governance platform that ensures that your experiments actually drive strategic decisions, not just more data. We help experimentation leaders move beyond the chaos of disconnected tools and fragmented insights to build programs that scale sustainably and deliver what matters most: strategic business decisions at the highest level. So check us out at Efestra.com to see how we're helping organizations close the trust gap between experimentation promises and business reality. Until next time, my name is Manuel da Costa, the founder of Efestra. Keep questioning the noise.